Good morning. Glad you're here. I was trying to think of what would be a good class. And after watching the news this week, I decided it might be a good time to have a refresher course on love. With all the anger and political hate out there, it's just sad. You'd think with all the problems the country's got, we quit hating each other long enough to work together to fix it. But the Apostle Paul says, "Now I will show you the most excellent way." In other words, this is the highest, the most excellent way. He says when you look at all of things and everything in life and all the problems and all the struggles and all the issues, the greatest thing that we can do is to love each other. Jesus himself had said that to his disciples, "Men will know that you are my followers if you love each other." It's not about the doctrine. It's not about the theology. It's about loving one another. That's the primary mark of the Christian, of the follower of Jesus Christ. For God so loved the world. And so Paul says this is the most excellent way. So today I want to talk about biblical love. Now the problem for us is there's a great love deception in the world. When we hear the word love, and we hear it all the time. I mean, most songs have the word love in it, and we hear love, 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 love. When we hear the word love in our culture, what comes to mind? What do you think of? Feelings, okay. Physical, okay. But generally, love in our culture is a feeling. I've had people come to my office with marital problems and they say, "Well, I've fallen out of love with my spouse," or "I don't love my spouse." And I always say, the problem is you don't know what love is. You can't fall out and in of biblical love. That's not a thing. And if we understand what biblical love is, it's not something you can fall out of. It's not something you fall into. It's almost like it's an accident or it's this sudden revelation. No, that's not biblical love. But that's the way our culture looks at it. And usually we say, "Well, do you love someone?" Instantly we think, "Well, how do I feel toward that person?" But biblical love has nothing to do with feelings. It's not about the way you feel. Biblical love is a decision. It's what you choose to do. Now, in 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 8, we have the qualities of true biblical love. We're going to go over those to make sure we understand what they mean, because the way we use them, most of them are not the way they're meant in Scripture. The first thing we notice when we study this passage, and this is an unfortunate translation problem. Sometimes when you're translating one language into another, it's very difficult to get an accurate word-for-word translation. Some words don't translate that way. And in the Greek, now, first of all, it says, verse 4, "Love is patient, love is kind, it does not envy, it does not boast." What part of speech is that? Kathleen, you're an English expert. What part of speech is that? Love is patient. Okay. Okay, but in this case, it's a noun. And what's love is patient? What's patient? An adjective. Okay. So in English, you've got a noun and an adjective. Love, patience. But in Greek, it's a verb. The whole thing is a verb. Love is patient is a verb. Love is kind is a verb. Well, what's a verb? And that's an action. Love is what you do. It's not what you feel. It has nothing to do with feelings. Love is a choice. It is an action. You may not like someone at all and still love them. It's what I choose to do. Does God ever command us to like everybody? No. God does not command us to like everybody. Why? God doesn't command our feelings because feelings change. I mean, you wake up every morning, you feel differently. You know, when you get married, you know, some days you love each other so much you could just eat each other up. And then some days you wish you had. Love, not that that ever happens to me, but I mean, but our feelings change day to day, minute to minute. But love, biblical love, is a choice. And it does not change. I choose to love you regardless. And that's what we have to understand. So when God tells me to love someone that is mean or I don't know or is my enemy, when he says love your enemies, how is that possible? Well, it's not if it's a feeling. But if it's choice, I can choose to love my enemy. It's the action that I take. He then gives us a series of verbs to describe what actions we are to take. So, love is a verb. It's an action. That's the first thing we've got to get through our thick skulls. It doesn't matter what our feelings are. So if a man tells me I have fallen out of love with my wife, usually when I do marriage counseling, the first thing I ask the couple, I'll turn to the woman and I'll say, do you love this man? And she always says, well, yeah. And I'll turn to the guy and say, do you love this woman? Well, sure. I say, now what does that mean? And they, they don't know. And when you talk about falling out of love, if love is an action, what's the only way you can fall out of love? You quit doing the action. Yeah, that's the only way to fall out of love, biblically speaking, is if you quit doing the requirements of love. So love is a verb. That's the first thing I've got to get through my thick skull. It doesn't matter about the feelings. Now, if you do the actions, eventually what happens to the feelings? They'll follow. That's why people who got married who had never seen each other before very often had very successful marriages because they didn't start off with this infatuation kind of love, this feeling love. They started off being forced to love each other. And so they learned to love each other. And that's why in a good marriage, as time goes on, you love each other more and more and more because you've been doing the things of love. The feelings will come, but the feelings are not the measure of biblical love. All right, the first quality, love is patient. Why do you suppose he started with patience? The Bible never does anything by accident. Why do you suppose he started with patience? It's one of the more difficult elements. I have taught this material 100 times over the years, and I'll usually ask a class after we've gone through all of these, I'll say, which one of these qualities do you think you need the most? And by far, which one do you suppose people pick? Patience. I need patience. Also, when he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, patience is one of the first things listed because it's so difficult. It's such a necessary thing. Now, when we use the word patience in English, what do we normally mean? If I'm patient with you, what does that normally mean? Put up with a lot. Yeah. But in the biblical use of the word patience means literally long suffering, a willingness to be insulted, a willingness to be hurt, and what? Not hurt back. It's very simple, but it goes flying against our nature. Suppose a man comes home from work, had a hard day, boss is on his case all day, nothing worked right, traffic was miserable on the way home, he's hot and tired and exhausted and put out, and he walks in the door, and his wife is glad to see him. So she comes walking across the floor, and she says, well, good afternoon, good to see you. And what does he say? What's for dinner? Now, how does that make her feel? Ma'am? Not too good. Her feelings are hurt. He hurt her. Instead of greeting her and saying, good to see you, I love you, what's for dinner? Now, when somebody hurts us, what do? We jab them back. Yeah, what he did is he took a little dart off his tongue and he zapped her with it. So what does she do? She takes a little bigger dart, because when somebody hurts you, you want to hurt them back a little worse. So she takes a little bigger dart and she zaps him with it. And what does she say? She says, well, with that attitude, nothing. So what does he do? He takes a little bigger dart and he zaps her and says, well, what you been doing all day? So she takes a dagger off of her tongue and she's waxing with the dagger. And she says, I've been taking care of your rotten kids and washing your filthy clothes and so forth. So he takes out a sword and say, well, it doesn't look like you've been doing anything to me. And before long, they're going at each other, hurting each other. Before long, we're throwing atom bombs. We started off with little darts, and now we're up to atom bombs. What would it have taken to stop this fight from ever happening? I mean, he came in, he was not thinking straight, and he zapped her, said her something ugly. What would it have taken to stop this thing in the beginning? If she had not hurt back. Now, he was wrong. He should not have said what he did. But if somebody hurts me and I love them, what does God say I will do? I will not hurt back. So when somebody says something ugly to me, something that's hurtful, God says, if you love them, don't hurt back. Now, if she had ignored his first statement, just completely ignored it, walked up, gave him a kiss and a hug, says, I see you've had a hard day, why don't you sit down? What would have happened to this fight? Nothing. At any point, if either one of us had stopped hurting back, if either the husband or the wife had stopped hurting, what would have happened to the fight? It would have been over. So patience says, I'm not going to retaliate. When you hurt me, if you offend me, if you hurt my feelings, if you say something I don't like, I'm just going to choose to not retaliate. Either say nothing or say something kind, and the fight would be over. Why is this hard?
Because they were wrong.
I mean, when somebody hurts us, why is it so hard for us just to ignore it? Well, like he says, they're wrong. That's not our nature. Our human nature says, if somebody hurts me, I am going to hurt them back. If they slap me, what do? Slap them back or punch them in the mouth. You know, if somebody says something mean, I say something mean back. But God says, if my primary directive is love, I don't have to hurt back. I make a choice. If you say something mean to me, I'm just not going to retaliate. I'm not going to hurt back. What would happen in our culture if we all practiced this? Now, as human beings, all of us occasionally are going to say something foolish. We're going to say something hurtful. Sometimes we don't even mean to. But if we all practice this one thing, I'm not going to hurt back. When somebody hurts me, I am going to refuse to retaliate. Can you imagine what would happen? The divorce rate would drop to almost nothing. But it's hard for us to do. The second element of patience, now we usually use the word patient in putting up with or waiting. Well, you don't have any patience. You're not willing to wait. That's the second definition. Patience is waiting for God to change the other person. Now, how's that different from our normal way? Yeah, I want to change. Yeah, when we got married, I wanted her to change to meet what I liked. And she wanted to change me, believe it or not. And so patience says, if this person needs changing, then what? If I love you, and if you need changing, then what? Wait God for doing. If they need changing, God will work on it. And God will do a better job than I will. And so patience, biblically speaking, is I refuse to hurt you back if you hurt me, and I'm willing to wait for God to change you. I don't have to force you to change to meet my desires, the way I want things. Now, why is that hard? It takes too long. Yeah, you've been waiting 40 years or 50 years, still hasn't changed me. But again, we all have our ideas of how particularly our spouses ought to be. And so we're going to force them to change the way we want them to be. And God says, if I love you, I'm going to let him do the changing. And I don't have to force you to change to meet my desires. All right. This next one is another word that we know instinctively what it means, but when you try to define it, it's hard. Love is kind. How do you define kindness? Now, do you know when somebody's being kind to you? Do your head this way. Yeah, we know what it means when somebody's kind to us. How do you define it? That's actually the biblical definition. The word kind means to be useful, to be helpful. And so if I'm kind to you, if I love you, then what I do is kindness is a useful thing. It's helpful. If I'm kind to you, I don't do things that aren't helpful. Now, there are two areas of kindness. What are they? Well, I'm glad you asked. The word means to be useful or to be helpful. They're kind words. What kind of words are useful and helpful? Okay, please, thank you, compliments. What kind of words are not helpful and useful? Critical, angry, hateful. Ma'am? Harsh. How many of us like for other people to speak to us harshly, angrily, critically? None of us. So if I love you, God says, don't use those words. Don't be angry. Don't be harsh. Don't be critical. Use words that are useful, that build people. Matter of fact, Paul says elsewhere, only use words that build others up. When was the last time somebody came in and says, you're ugly and stupid, and you felt like that was building you up? It doesn't. It's amazing how words can influence a person's life, particularly children. I remember growing up, I was very uncoordinated. I can still stumble around, but when I was a kid, I was terrible. I mean, I could trip over my own feet. My basketball coach literally told me I was the only kid he ever had that could trip over the center line painted on the floor. And I was told that I was slow running, not slow mentally, that may be too, but slow running, and I was told that I was uncoordinated. So guess how I grew up? Believing that I was slow and uncoordinated. And then one day I was visiting my cousins, and we were playing a game. A bunch of us kids were out running and playing a game. And this boy told me, he says, boy, you're fast. And literally, that's all it took to change my life. And from then on, I began to believe that I was fast, and I became one of the fastest runners in the class. A lot of it has to do with the way people tell you and perceive you. The point is, when we use kind words with people, they are useful, helpful. God says, if I love you, I'm not going to criticize you and be angry with you and be harsh and mean. Why do we do that? Why are we harsh with people? We don't like people being harsh with us. Why are we ever harsh to others? Why do we say mean things? We've all done it. That's sad, but you're right. It's sad that I can feel better about myself by being mean to you. That's pitiful, but you're right. Why else do we do it? Lack of care? Yeah. If you're driving down the road and somebody cuts you off, why do you scream and yell ugly words at them? It's what? Well, they're taking up my space, but why? How does it help for me to yell at them and say mean things? You're stupid. You're ignorant, you know. I know. Somehow it makes me feel better. That's sad, isn't it? But again, that goes back to that human nature that we have to get beyond. Love is the denial of our human nature, because love is not a natural thing for us. What is natural? Selfishness. We are all born with a selfish streak. When we come home from the hospital, who do we care about as babies? Ourselves. Do you care if mom has to get up at 3 a.m. to feed? No. We want what we want. Now, that's normal for babies, but what happens to us as we grow? Some of us don't ever grow out of it. And we all know adults who are still acting like babies. They're totally self-absorbed. They want everything for themselves. Well, that's the problem with love. Love is not selfishness. Love is the opposite of selfishness. But it's our nature to be selfish, and we have to learn to grow out of it. And that's part of my Christian experience, is to growing out of selfishness. So there are kind words, but there are also kind actions. What are useful actions? What are helpful actions? Sure. If I see somebody that needs some help, help them. You know, if you see somebody that's dropped something and they needs help picking it up, help them pick it up. That's useful. And so whatever actions or words we can take to be helpful to people is a kindness. And God says, if I love you, then I want to help you however I can. And then he says, love does not envy. Now this is another word that is used a little differently in the Bible than we normally use it. What is envy? Yeah, envy is a deeper, darker form of jealousy. Now what is jealousy? Yeah, you've got something or something's happened good to you that I am jealous of. Envy is a deeper, darker form of jealousy. Jealousy says, I wish I had what you've got. Envy says, I wish I had what you've got and you didn't have it. I mean, it's an ugly thing. And we see things that other people have, and we can be envious of it. And we say, well, I deserve that. What have they done better than me? They just lucky, or they inherited it, or whatever. And it's easy for us to be envious of someone else. What's the Christian attitude toward this? I mean, envy is obviously not the Christian attitude. What's the Christian attitude? Yeah. I'm glad you've got what you've got. You know, instead of being envious, we say, well, good for you. Envy is a form of jealousy. Like I said, it's a little darker, deeper, uglier form of jealousy. This is not real common in marriage. Usually we're not envious of our spouses or our children, although it can happen. He then says that love does not boast. By the way, the literal word there in Greek is windbag. What is boasting? What's the common word we use? Brag. Now, the question is, why do we brag? Yeah. Somehow, if I tell you how wonderful I am or what I've got that's so wonderful, it makes me feel better. Again, that's kind of sick if you think about it. But it's part of our nature. We want others to look at us and think highly of us, so sometimes we brag. Now, what's the problem with bragging? Other than God says it's not a good thing. Ma'am? Well, for one thing, well, that's true too. Biblically, everything we've got comes from God. But when we brag, how do people look at us? Yeah. I remember vividly, many years ago, I was playing in a golf tournament with my good buddy. And the two of us entered the tournament, and they paired us with two other guys that we didn't know to make a foursome. It was a two-man tournament, and they made foursomes out of us. Well, one of the guys that we were paired with came walking up barefooted. Well, that's pretty rare in golf. You don't see many golfers out barefooted because, for one thing, golf courses have stickers and pine cones and all kinds of stuff. But this guy walked up barefooted. So we thought right off the bat that was kind of odd. But he immediately started telling us how he could hit a golf ball. He said, I can hit a golf ball 320 yards with my driver. He says, I have to get special drivers because I hit the ball so hard it'll crush the heads on the driver. And he said, I can hit a 5-iron 250 yards. I mean, he started telling us all before he ever hit the first golf ball. Naturally, how did my friend and I feel about this guy? What a jerk, you know. I mean, he bragged and bragged and bragged about how he could hit a golf ball. And he got up on the first tee, took his driver out, and hit it 320 yards, just like he said. He took a 5-iron out, hit it 250. Tiger Woods can't hit a 5-iron 250 yards. This guy literally could do what he said. But by then, how did we feel about him? He's a jerk. He's a braggart. Didn't matter that he could do it. Now, what if he hadn't have said a word to start with? If he'd just gotten up and hit his driver 320 yards? We'd have been, wow, you're the greatest golfer ever. Tiger Woods ought to be taking lessons from you. But because he was bragging, we didn't care. We looked at him as a bad person because he was bragging. So bragging doesn't really accomplish anything anyway. But God says, if I love you, I don't have to try to impress you by telling you how wonderful I am. If I really am wonderful, then what? You'll find out about it. I don't have to brag about it. And bragging just turns people off. So God says love is not boasting. And then he starts meddling now. Love is not proud. Bible talks a lot about pride. It's always a bad thing. Now, sometimes we use the word pride in a positive way. We say we have pride in our work or pride in our children. That's fine. But when the Bible uses the word pride, what's it talking about? What is pride? That's one strong element of pride. It certainly is, yeah. Let's go back to the illustration I gave with patience, where the husband comes home and he says something ugly to the wife says something ugly back, and they get to going back and forth, and they get to fussing and fighting. And before long, they're saying mean things that they don't really mean. And then when they do get around to eating dinner, how does it taste? Tastes terrible. The few times that I have argued with my wife and we try to eat, it just tastes, I don't care if it's filet mignon, it tastes like cardboard. And then when you go to bed, what happens? Where does he sleep? If he's not on the couch. On his side of the bed. And which way is his back turned? Toward her. And where is she sleeping? On her side of the bed with her back to him, and there's this big lake of ice in between. And some people, as a marriage counselor, I've had this go on for days with people. What would it take to stop this? I mean, they had the argument, they said ugly things. What would it take to stop it? Ma'am? Yes. If either one said, man, I am so sorry I said those ugly things. I didn't mean them. I'm sorry I said your mother looks like a German shepherd. I didn't really mean it. Why won't we do that? Pride. It's sheer pride. Now, have you ever had an argument in which you thought, as you were arguing, man, I'm in the wrong here? Shake your head this way. When you argue with somebody, what do you always think? You're right and they're wrong. I've never had an argument when I thought the other person was right and I was wrong at the time. Now, later on, I might realize, yeah, they were right. But at the time I'm arguing, I'm right. Now, my pride says what? I'm not giving in. She's the one that's wrong. When I ask her where my stuff was, she should know. I may have put it there, but she ought to know where it is. I mean, it is sheer pride that keeps us from stopping a foolish, foolish argument. You see, pride cannot admit that it's wrong. One of the number one complaints that teenagers have about their fathers, guess what? He can't admit he's wrong. And that's true. It's hard for a father, or any adult for that matter, to admit to a child, I was wrong. And so God says, if I love you, I'm willing to admit that I was wrong. Now, in an argument between two people, how often is one person 100% right and the other person 100% wrong? Now, what does our logic say? I shouldn't say, I'm sorry first. Why? Because I'm more right. When Sharon and I argue, I'm usually about 30% wrong and she's 70% wrong. So since she's 70% wrong, why should I admit I'm wrong? She should have to admit she's wrong first. But what's she thinking? Oh, yeah. Now, how would God have me look at that? Even if that's right, even if she's 70% wrong and I'm 30% wrong, how would God have me to look at that? I'm still wrong. God said, even if you're not as wrong as she is, you're still wrong. So what's my responsibility? To admit I'm wrong. It doesn't matter if I'm 30% wrong, 70% wrong, or 90% wrong. If I'm wrong, God says, admit it. And we could stop these arguments. We could stop fights. But our pride won't let us admit we were wrong. A second element of pride that we don't think about a lot that's just as valid is pride demands its rights. This is a tough one. It took me a long time to bend my mind around it, but once I did, I realized I had the wrong concept of this all along. What is the only cause of anger other than godly anger? I demand my rights. When I come home from work, do I have a right to have dinner on the table? No. Do I have a right to have my clothes folded up and put in the right place? No. Where do we get our rights? What rights does this book give me? The only right in this book that I have, God gives me the right to either accept Him or reject Him. He doesn't force me. Now, if I reject Him, I pay the consequences, but that's my right. But as far as rights in this world, what rights are we given? Well, as an American citizen, I have certain rights, such as, what are some rights I have as an American citizen? Ma'am? Sure, I have a right to vote. I have the right to a jury trial. There are certain rights that I have as an American citizen, given to me by the government. But what rights do I have in my relationships with other people? We don't have any. Do I have the right to be treated with respect? No, I don't have a right. Now, should we treat each other with respect? Yes. But is it a right? If it's a right, where's it come from? Who guarantees that right? It's not a right. It's an assumption. We all believe we should be treated with respect, and we should treat each other with respect, but it's not a right. Jesus Christ is God. Was He treated with respect? No. Did He demand He be treated with respect? No. So you see, and like I said, it took me a while to bend my mind around this. We have rights, but where did they come from? We assumed them. We decided, I have this right. I expect my wife to treat me a certain way. And when she doesn't, I get mad. Why? Because she's violated one of my rights that nobody ever gave me to start with. I just assumed it. And so we assume we have these rights, but they are assumed. They're not given by God. All right, we have time for one more. Love is not rude. What does that word mean? Rude? What does it mean to be rude to somebody? This is another one of those words. We know what it means, but how do you define it? What does it mean to be rude? Yeah. What'd you say? Rudeness basically means that I do something that I know offends you. Now, something may not be offensive to someone, but it may be offensive to someone else. For example, if you grew up in a family, say all boys out in the farm, and you grew up with your elbows on the table, is that rude? If everybody in the family puts their elbows on the table, is that rude? No, it doesn't offend anybody. But if you marry some girl from the city who was taught that putting your elbows on the table is rude, when you're with her, how should you treat her? You don't put your elbows on the table because that's rude. And this is one of the problems when you get married. You're coming from two different cultures. And one thing one culture might consider rude, the other one doesn't. But God says, if I love you, what do I do? I don't do things that you find offensive. If I know you don't like it, don't do it. And that's one of the adjustments that married couples have to make. We find out what the other person doesn't like, so you don't do that. Now, I've run across couples who deliberately did that. Do it just to prove I can do it. Well, that's rude. God says, don't do that. If you love somebody, don't do things they find offensive. That's not Christian. It's also bad manners. If I practice bad manners, that's rude. I was taught as a child, show good manners. That's just what loving people do. All right, we'll pick up there next time. Thanks for being here.